When I've been studying jazz for 40 years, and when I hadn't had a lesson in a long time, and when it was time for me to take another piano lesson, I chose to have that lesson with Mr. Nick Rosen. And it was a great experience for me, even as an experienced jazz musician, to get connected to Nick and what he was about. And I just couldn't wait to introduce you to him. Nick, hello, how are you today?
I'm good, Adam. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Uh, why don't we're going to talk a lot about jazz today, as that's your specialty. That's the area that you most like to teach.
hmm
Before we do, could you just tell us a little something about yourself as a person? How you got started as being a musician and who you are.
Sure. My name is Nick Rosen, originally from Miami. Been living in Atlanta for about a little over 10 years, closer to 11. And I've been playing music all my life. I started when I was 5 years old, and I got into playing jazz specifically in high school, and have been making a career of it for a little over maybe about 10 to 15 years.
So before you were playing jazz, you said 15 was when you got into jazz. What were you doing
Mhm.
before that for 10 years?
Well, I started when I was about five, and I started playing classical, and all the things that came along with it. But yeah, I didn't get into any music that required me to improvise or have a voice or anything like that until I was about 14 or 15, and it kind of naturally led me into playing jazz music.
Was this a revelation for you when you found jazz? Was it like, oh, wow, I'm home? Or was it kind of like a gradual thing?
Yeah, absolutely a gradual thing. The well is very, very deep with that kind of music, as I know you know. So, the more you dive into it, the more you see how deep it actually goes, you know? So when I was 15 or 16, I was just scratching the surface. Even when I went to college, I decided to major in jazz studies, but it wasn't until I was like maybe about 22 or 23 that I really realized the possibilities inherent in that music, and I just kind of gave myself fully over to it.
Okay, well, what are the possibilities?
Different for everybody.
Let me make it a more specific question.
Sure.
What were the possibilities for you?
Um, Again, just kind of an infinite, you know what I mean, well of possibilities, improvisationally, compositionally, the ability to sort of find your own voice through the construct of that music, but also realizing that though it has a construct and though there is parameters with you, which you have to succeed, you can also very easily bypass those and begin to experiment very freely. And I've done shows that were very rigid, so to speak, in the form of jazz, but I've done also the ones that were very, very free, like literally, three people improvising with no form, no sense of key structure, no sense of harmony, just true language in the freest of sense, freest sense possible.
Well, now there's some people out there that they've heard of jazz and they maybe have heard it on the radio a little bit or read about it, but to them, the idea that there's actually different ways to play, like, what do you mean
Mm-hmm.
the strictest possible?
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk
Mm-hmm.
about these
Mm-hmm.
different?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, just like in classical music, we talk about Baroque, Romantic, Impressionistic, all these different styles that fall under the umbrella of this one very broad style of music is very, very similar to jazz music. The only difference I would say is that jazz music developed in such a short amount of time, within a century, rather where classical took, multiple centuries to sort of evolve and and become what it is today. And of course, it's still evolving. But when I say rigid, as far as jazz music, we have these songs that are part of the repertoire. And a lot of the times when we will play a gig, we'll kind of stick very similar, rigidly into that realm. Now you can still improvise, you can still create um, different ways to express yourself through these standards. But all in all, the parameters are very strict in the sense, and that's kind of how we survive, honestly, on the bandstand. And it gives us a chance to take risks, because we have this home base to come back to. So, and then of course, beyond that, you have a ton of musicians that are willing to push those boundaries. And I've even heard people play standards where they'll start something and then they'll just go off and they'll never return back home, you know? And that's a beautiful way of doing it as well.
And that's the other end. That's the freer end.
Exactly.
And you haven't mentioned things like big band gigs, which can be very strict as classical music. How does
Absolutely.
how do you call that jazz if there's almost no improvisation involved?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that when we're calling that jazz, we're talking about both the style and the language. You know what I mean? But jazz is essentially, to me, is a rhythmic and melodic language that you learn to speak. You know, and if you listen to the great big band recordings, those recordings and those songs are chock full of that language, both rhythmic, melodic, and harmonic, you know? And I think that you can easily identify jazz by those things. Now, improvisation is kind of a different thing. You know what I mean? You're using the language to improvise over the forms. But improvisation exists across all spectrums of music and all spectrums of life. But just since we're talking about music, I remember going to see a concert when I was in college. It was a Baroque pianist, and she was incredible, you know. And she was doing, oh man, I think it was a cantata, you know, a Bach cantata, and she improvised the sections in between the orchestral, the orchestral sections and between the orchestral sections, really. But it
Yeah.
was improvised in a Baroque style. You know, so she wasn't reading off anything. She was just improvising, but because she knew the language, you know, she was able to create something, express herself. It's like, you know, a great poet, you know what I mean? They're so well versed in English that they can pull from all of these different, you know, different things and create something that is uniquely their own. So even though jazz is a style of music, I more identify it as a language than anything else.
Hmm. Okay. Well, how
Mm.
do we? So, can you talk a little about the difference? Because, as you said, yeah, there's improvisation everywhere. In
Right.
fact, those Baroque composers that wrote the music,
Right.
they were improvising when they wrote it, and then the idea of
Absolutely.
improvising just stopped for a couple hundred years. What is different about jazz improvisation from improvising in front of a Baroque ensemble?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that it stopped for 100 years, but I would say, or for a couple hundred years, but I would definitely say that it didn't become, it wasn't encouraged to be a part of that style of music. I mean, I would say that again. Sorry, repeat that question one more time. So I can
Oh,
answer
it's
it correctly.
okay. So the question is, as I said, I agree with you that people were improvising in
Right, right,
classical
right,
music the whole time, but
right, right,
there
right, right,
did
right.
come a point in classical music where people were saying, you know what, Bach is the way he wrote it is good
Oh
enough for me. It
yes,
should be good
right,
enough for
exactly.
you. Don't
Yes,
go
exactly.
messing
Yes,
around, which is not what Bach
totally.
wanted. So,
Right, exactly, exactly.
so
Yep.
how is, and people brought that back in the last 50 years or
Mhm.
so with some classical
Most
improvisation.
definitely.
But how is that
Got
different
you.
from what jazz musicians are doing?
I mean, that I can't say I can answer that 100%, but the only because I mean, to me, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. You know, you're
Mhm.
improvising within a certain set of parameters, and you're expressing a certain language that you know very well. But I mean, I will say that when I was young, I had a clinician come into my high school, and they explained it like this to me, like when we're playing a standard, like we're talking about, like for example, one of the very famous ones that a lot of people might know is like Take Five, for example. So you would play that very, very famous melody, and then you would improvise off of that melody, and then you would end the song with the melody. And the way he described it to me was like a sandwich. You have the piece of bread, which is the melody, you have the meat and everything, which is the improvisation, and then you have the other piece of bread, which is the melody out. You know what I'm saying? So the majority, I think, the main difference, now that I'm realizing it, is that the majority of what you would listen to in a jazz situation is improvisational.
Okay, and so that takes me to, I have to ask, this is going to be kind of a funny question, but you talked
Mm,
about a situation in which there was no initial melody, or which we may not come back to the melody. Isn't that kind of a mess?
exactly.
Who wants a handful of meat? Why is that appealing?
I mean, I can't answer that. It's to each his own,
But
you
yet it
know?
is, though. I mean, I'm only being devil's advocate here. You and I have both heard
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fantastic performances in that vein. So
Yeah.
how does
I
that
mean,
work?
it's the, again, you're just dealing with a language, and the better you speak that language, the more eloquent and the more translatable it can be. That would be my best answer.
In any
But
situation.
as you, in any situation, but
Yeah.
as you very well know, so do I. Art is so subjective. You know what I mean? What I
Right.
think might be brilliant, somebody else might think is terrible, and neither of us are wrong or right. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk about teaching now. You obviously
Yeah,
want your students to feel that you want them to understand that art is subjective, and yet you
for
don't want
sure.
them coming out of your lessons thinking, well, the teacher said I didn't do a good job, but that's all subjective, right? How do you draw the line
Exactly,
between
exactly.
what is necessary to know and what is subjective?
Man, that is such a great question. To me, what I really, really value in my students is, the idea that they're getting something, from music, you know what I mean? And that I'm just sort of like the conduit to kind of help translate that. Music is such a deep well, like we were saying, and it has so much to offer that for me, I am most concerned that my students go as deep into that well as they feel they feel necessary for themselves. So a lot of times what I will do is I will help them to meet their goals in their way. I've had a lot of students that you could tell just they're not interested in reading music. That's just not something that they're really, really passionate about. So I don't force that on them. You know what I'm saying? I want them to kind of find their goals in their own way. And luckily, because, I mean, not to toot my own horn, but I've had so much experience with all these different styles of music, I have a way of being able to teach in both a traditional way and a non-traditional way. So whatever is best for the student is what I go ahead and I try to adapt to them, essentially.
Can you can say no to this, but can you give us an example of both situations?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I could just kind of go deeper into each one. I
Sure.
mean, for one thing, if somebody really, really responds to a traditional lesson, it would behoove them to learn scales, arpeggios, correct technique, you know what I mean? Those kinds of things, how to read music, you know what I mean? If it really just like, and that's how they can essentially dip their toes into the well of music. But I think that one of the things that we don't do enough in music education is we don't realize that music is fun. You know what I mean? Music is enjoyable. You know what I'm saying? So if somebody wants to just beat the piano, you know what I mean, over and over again until they find something that relates to them, that's easily a way to deal with it. You know what I mean? If you look to like young I'm talking kids, young musicians from Cuba, young musicians from Africa, they don't know how to read music, but yet their rhythmic and their rhythmic understanding of the language is so far superior than a lot of European influenced musicians. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
That you can't just say, oh, that's not, well, they don't know how to read music. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's very, very important to sort of honor that in each individual. Some people, and it's not about heritage, it's just about how you best learn. It's a cultural thing, in my opinion. You know?
Hmm. Now you read music, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about those people that want to learn to read music?
Oh, teach them how to read music.
And
you
well,
know it's reading music is less of a language and more of a skill.
mhm.
So really, I mean, I would just say, it's just about, as the more you do it, the better you get at it. And the hardest thing to do with reading music, as I'm sure you guys struggle, is to kind of like connect, you know what I mean, that natural impulse to express with what you're seeing on the page. How many times have you heard a student just read like a book report or something? They're just reading it like monotone like
Right.
this. You know what I mean? I always tell my students, I'm like, well, you don't speak like that, so why would you play like that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Because the act of
Like
reading
I
can
don't.
be so right.
No, go ahead, please,
I was
please,
just going
please.
to say the act of reading is such an
Yeah,
overwhelming thing for so many people that it just completely occupies all the real estate of the brain until it's integrated.
totally,
Yeah.
exactly. Yep.
Well, Tell
without
me
a doubt.
about the piano specifically regarding jazz, because you're not a saxophone teacher, you're a piano teacher.
Right.
What
That's right.
how is it different to play the piano in jazz? What's the special role the jazz piano player has in this music?
Man, I mean, that's an amazing question. I mean, for me, the piano is, it's everything really, because it's support, both rhythmic and harmonic. And when I say harmonic, I mean using chords and multiple um, notes at a time to enhance what's going on. Obviously, rhythmic meaning, like, during a situation where everybody else is playing, if I'm just holding chords down the whole time like you would in maybe a pop song or something like that, that obviously doesn't support the situation that's what's going on, because there's no lift. But it also can be a melodic instrument. I'll give you a little bit of an example.
Please.
So, so in that song "Autumn Leaves" I was mentioning, the melody goes like this. Now, when I add chords to that, so what I did was I supported the melody by adding those harmonies, right? And now, if a saxophonist player, for example, is playing the melody while I'm supporting them, it would sound like this. And what that did is, you know what I mean? That obviously you can put the conversation between both the melody and the chords. So if you can imagine, in a real life situation, that aspect of it is just magnified tenfold.
Well, so I'm going to tell you a funny story. Um,
Sure.
when I was at Georgia State studying, I had a chance to play with the Georgia State Big Band, and I was the
Mm-hmm.
piano player for the big band. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
most powerful lessons I learned, which I continued to learn as I played with rock bands and stuff, was
Mm-hmm.
that in some cases, the less you play, the better. I think
Mm-hmm.
my teacher, Jeff Hayden, told me that in being in a big band is more about learning when not to play than when to play. And
Right. Absolutely.
it's amazing how little you can play and actually really support and sound good.
Well said. I mean, and if you don't mind me asking, what was your main tool that you used to know when and when not to play?
To tell you the truth, it really took me several years in rock bands, in a rock band
Right.
that I was in, and listening
Right.
to recordings of myself playing with them. To
Right.
I heard myself bang, bang, bang all the time. I'm like, that
Right.
didn't
Exactly.
sound like it felt.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Because in the moment you're just like expressing yourself, right? So, okay, so this brings up a great point. To me, what I try to do, both as a musician and as a teacher, is I tell folks they have to listen right in the moment, and it is and the level that it takes to get past feeling comfortable playing the piano, feeling comfortable reading music, to continue to then just have that sort of be an automatic, natural thing, to begin to start to solely use your ears and react. That is the level that you aspire to be as a professional musician. You get all the kinks out of the way, right? You practice your scales, yeah, exactly, practice your reading music. So then all of a sudden you can know when to play and when not to play by using your ears, right? And of course, sometimes it's appropriate to play a whole lot, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's appropriate to just take your hands off the piano, you know what I mean? And not play anything at all.
And
It
the
does take
rules
some
about that can change from gig to gig, even within the same ensemble. It's not like
moment to
those rules
moment,
are written down.
moment to moment, recording to recording. It's unbelievable, man. You could literally, and that is one of the most things that's special about the music that we're talking about now, because it has the ability to mutate and is so malleable from moment to moment, that there's always something new to discover, which is, I guess, what drew me to it in such a way, and what keeps me, 20 years after I really discovered it, as passionate about getting better at it now as I was, even learning it to begin with.
Yeah. Well, you've played us a little Autumn Leaves, and that's a very famous standard that everybody
Yeah,
has to know.
of course.
If you want to, is there something else you could play us that you just love that maybe isn't often played, but it's one of your favorites?
Happy to.
Autumn in New York, played by Mr. Nick Rosen. That's a
That's right. Autumn in New York has one of my
beautiful
favorite
tune.
songs.
I'll
Thanks.
be
Yeah, yeah.
checking that recording out to learn what I can. I actually want to ask you a question about your performance of that. As a beginner to jazz, and I have to say, even all up until today, I find I'm very caught up and fascinated in all the little tricks and things that you put in there, all the pieces. I could take that
Mm,
performance apart and say, well,
mm-hmm,
he did this and he did that and he did that. But when I had my lesson with you, you
mm-hmm.
kind of kicked my legs out from under me and said, just listen to the melody. It's got to start with the melody. It's got to start with that, and all that other stuff. You just kind of discouraged me from getting fixated on it. So
Absolutely.
how are you?
Absolutely.
How are you? How do you? What's the difference between a player who can do all of those things but never lose the core versus somebody that
Yes.
just does all those things and you end up listening to them instead of the music?
Mm, man, what a phenomenal question. I don't know that I have the true answer to that. But the only thing that I would say is that it goes back to, I think, the language. The language of the music has to be paramount first and foremost. And you can really, really tell the difference between somebody who is using the language and just expressing them, and or just kind of like, I don't want to say spinning their wheels, but it just there's no root and no foundation, right? You know what I'm saying? The learning the language to me is so paramount because you have the ability then to express yourself with this. It'd be the same thing as if I really, didn't know how to speak English, but I was still being very expressive. You might get the expression. You might, oh well, man, he really means what he's saying, but I don't get what he's saying. You know what I mean? Uh, the the music is very, very similar with that. I just really feel like if you can listen to the music and you can understand it on an innate level, then that means that whatever person you're listening to has spent time with the music in a way that has allowed them to get a foundation, again, both rhythmically, harmonically, and melodically. Going back to Autumn Leaves, if you don't mind, if
Oh.
I was to improvise over that, right? You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So, basically what I did is like I honored the fact that the melody.
Okay, as opposed to what? Do it the other way. Do it the way
I
somebody
don't,
might.
I don't know that I can.
Yeah, you can. Come on, you can do it. Play
I
it
don't,
back.
I don't. Well, I mean, I can play like I don't care. You know what I'm saying? But I don't know that I can do that. All right, I'll give it a try.
Right.
but
Very
you know
hip,
what's funny
but
though, man? But well, I wouldn't even say that. I mean, that's what's so funny, man. I mean, I think it's a I used to play with Colonel Bruce Hampton, and he would say it was just all about intention. You know, if your intention behind the music is what really will be the translatable action. You know what I mean? If somebody can tell, they can always tell. I've been in every kind of musical situation you could imagine. You know what I mean? And whenever I'm tuned into the intention of what I'm doing, then I'm most likely going to have a good performance. And whenever I'm not, and believe me, I've had some bad ones. You know what I'm saying? It's
yeah.
I'm not gonna have a good one. You know?
Well, Nick, it's really been a pleasure. I mean, I've just learned
Yeah.
an awful lot talking to you today, and it's
Thanks,
really
Adam.
very appreciative. Thank you very
Oh,
much for
pleasure,
talking with me.
pleasure.